Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind busy cities, glowing phone screens, endless notifications, and all the little worries that somehow insist on arriving right before bedtime. Instead, we're setting out on a much quieter journey, a slow climb into towering mountains where ancient builders accomplished something that still feels almost impossible. Imagine standing at the bottom of a massive cliff. The rock rises hundreds of feet above your head, nearly straight up, disappearing into drifting clouds. The wind whistles through narrow valleys. Birds circle lazily overhead, and somewhere high above, barely visible against the stone, sits an ancient temple, not on top of the mountain, not beside it, but built directly into the cliff itself. The obvious question is, why? Because if someone today suggested building a place of worship halfway up a vertical rock wall, most people would gently recommend finding a more accessible location, somewhere with level ground, maybe even a parking lot. Ancient engineers, however, seem to have looked at impossible landscapes and quietly said, "Yes, that will do nicely." Before we begin our climb into this remarkable story, I'd like to ask one small favor. If you enjoy relaxing history documentaries that help you unwind after a long day, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and let me know down in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always wonderful to see history lovers joining us from every corner of the world. Whether you're listening from a quiet farmhouse, a busy apartment, a college dorm, or somewhere halfway across the globe while the rest of your neighborhood sleeps. Now, settle into your favorite chair, curl up beneath a warm blanket, or simply close your eyes if you're already comfortable. Let your breathing slow naturally. There's no rush here. History has waited thousands of years for us. It can certainly wait another few seconds while you get comfortable. Tonight isn't about great battles. It isn't about famous emperors marching across continents. There won't be endless dates to memorize or complicated family trees that somehow involve 12 different kings, all named Philip, Charles, or Henry. History can be surprisingly creative when it comes to recycling names. Instead, tonight belongs to ordinary workers, stonecutters, whose names have disappeared into time, carpenters who shaped enormous wooden beams using little more than iron tools, patience, and extraordinary skill, rope makers who twisted together fibers strong enough to support the weight of entire buildings, monks who believed climbing closer to the heavens also brought them closer to peace, master engineers who solved problems so difficult that even modern architects occasionally pause, scratch their heads, and quietly admit, "That's actually quite impressive." For thousands of years, people have looked at hanging temples with the same mixture of admiration and confusion. How did they move enormous stones up cliffs? How did workers avoid falling? How were wooden beams anchored into solid rock? How did anyone decide this project sounded like a reasonable idea? These questions have fascinated travelers for centuries. Some believed supernatural beings helped. Others imagined giants. A few preferred dragons. Humans have always enjoyed explaining difficult engineering with mythical creatures. It saves an incredible amount of paperwork. The truth, however, is far more interesting because ancient builders didn't possess magic. They possessed knowledge. They understood stone. They understood gravity. Perhaps most importantly, they understood patience. Modern construction projects often measure progress in days or weeks. Ancient builders sometimes measured progress in generations. A grandfather might help carve the first foundation. His son might spend decades shaping pillars. His grandson could be the one who finally watched priests light the first ceremonial incense inside the completed sanctuary. Imagine dedicating your family's lifetime to a building you might never see finished. That level of patience feels almost unimaginable today. Yet all across Asia, from rugged mountains in China to steep cliffs in India and beyond, communities devoted decades and sometimes centuries to creating sacred places suspended between earth and sky. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. Markets disappeared. Roads faded into winding trails. The sounds of daily life were replaced by birdsong, distant waterfalls, and the gentle whisper of mountain winds. Perhaps that silence was the entire point. Many religious traditions believed mountains were special places, not because mountains possessed magical powers, but because they created distance. Distance from crowded cities, distance from political arguments, distance from noisy marketplaces, distance from distractions, and perhaps, just perhaps, distance from the endless list of chores waiting back home. Although, judging by the amount of stone they hauled uphill, they may have accidentally created even more chores. As we'll discover tonight, building a temple into a cliff wasn't simply an architectural challenge. It was a statement, a declaration of faith, demonstration of engineering, a test of endurance, and occasionally spectacular display of human stubbornness, because there are easier places to build, many easier places, flat valleys, gentle hills, wide plains, literally almost anywhere else. Yet, generation after generation continued climbing higher, carrying heavier materials, inventing cleverer tools, and refusing to surrender to landscapes that seemed determined to push them away. Some temples were carved directly into solid cliffs. Others rested on enormous wooden beams driven deep into rock. Some appeared to float above empty valleys. Others hid inside mountain caves so well that travelers could walk past without ever realizing entire sanctuaries existed just beyond the stone. Even today, many visitors experience the same feeling: wonder, disbelief, curiosity, and perhaps just a tiny amount of nervousness when looking over the edge. Throughout tonight's journey, we'll follow the lives of the remarkable people who made these impossible places possible. We'll meet surveyors who planned buildings without satellites or laser levels, stone masons whose precision rivaled modern craftsmen, monks who sought silence among the clouds, travelers who risked dangerous mountain paths simply to reach sacred shrines, and engineers whose greatest achievements have survived earthquakes, storms, wars, and centuries of weather, despite many of their names being completely forgotten. History has a curious habit of remembering kings while quietly overlooking the people who actually built their dreams. Tonight, we'll give those builders the attention they deserve. So, as the wind begins to echo softly through ancient mountain valleys, and the first rays of morning sunlight touch cliffs that have stood unchanged for millions of years, allow yourself to imagine taking that first careful step along a narrow mountain path. The climb won't be fast. It isn't meant to be. Every step brings us a little closer to understanding how ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things with simple tools, remarkable determination, and an almost unbelievable amount of patience. Our journey begins not at the temple itself, but at the foot of the mountain, where one impossible idea first started to take shape. Chapter 1. Why build on vertical cliffs? Our story begins with a question that has puzzled travelers for centuries. Why? Why would anyone choose to build a temple halfway up a nearly vertical cliff when there were perfectly good fields, valleys, and gentle hills waiting below? It's the sort of decision that makes perfect sense only after you've already committed to carrying several thousand tons of stone uphill. Imagine you're an ancient master, builder, a local ruler approaches with a grand vision. We're going to build a temple? Wonderful. There is one small detail. Of course there is. It must hang from the side of that mountain. At this point, most sensible people would probably pretend they suddenly remembered another appointment. Ancient engineers, however, didn't have the luxury of politely declining royal requests, especially when those requests came from kings, emperors, wealthy monasteries, or influential religious leaders. So the planning began. But the decision wasn't simply about making life difficult for construction workers. There were powerful reasons behind these extraordinary locations. For many ancient cultures, mountains were sacred places. Long before organized religions built elaborate temples, people looked toward towering peaks with a mixture of wonder and respect. Mountains touched the clouds, storms gathered around them. Snow remained on their highest slopes even when the valleys below baked beneath the summer sun. From a distance, mountains seemed to connect the ordinary world with something far greater. If heaven existed somewhere above the clouds, then climbing a mountain felt like taking a small step toward it. The journey itself became part of worship. Pilgrims didn't simply arrive. They earned their arrival. Every steep trail, every uneven stone, every careful step reminded visitors that reaching something sacred required effort. Modern visitors often complain if the parking lot is more than a 5-minute walk from the entrance. Ancient pilgrims sometimes climbed for days. Perspective changes everything. The higher people climbed, the quieter life became. Down in the valleys, merchants argued over prices. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron. Children chased one another through dusty streets. Farmers shouted across their fields. Animals wandered everywhere they weren't supposed to. Life was wonderfully noisy, but mountains offered something different. Silence. Not complete silence, of course. The wind never truly stopped. Birds called across the cliffs. Water trickled through hidden springs. Leaves rustled gently in the breeze. Yet compared with the crowded towns below, the mountains felt peaceful. For monks seeking meditation, that silence wasn't merely pleasant. It was essential. Many believed distractions kept the mind trapped in ordinary concerns. The farther they traveled from everyday life, the easier it became to focus on prayer, reflection, and spiritual discipline. Building a monastery deep within a mountain wasn't simply choosing a scenic location. It was creating an environment designed for contemplation. Of course, there was another practical benefit. People rarely wandered into remote cliffside temples by accident. If someone reached your monastery after climbing a narrow mountain path for several hours, they almost certainly had a good reason for being there. Unexpected visitors became surprisingly uncommon. Ancient monks may not have invented privacy, but they certainly appreciated it. Some rulers had different motivations. A temple perched high upon a cliff became a powerful symbol. Anyone approaching from miles away could see it standing against the sky. It proclaimed wealth, power, devotion, engineering skill. It quietly announced that a kingdom possessed enough resources to accomplish what others considered impossible. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of constructing an astonishing skyline, except instead of glass skyscrapers, they used mountains. Some locations also held legendary importance. Long before construction began, perhaps a hermit had meditated inside a nearby cave. Perhaps a respected teacher claimed to have received divine inspiration there. Perhaps unusual rock formations inspired local stories passed from generation to generation. Sacred places often began with simple stories. One person experienced something remarkable, others visited. Small shrines appeared. Pilgrims followed. Eventually, someone suggested building a proper temple. One generation added a staircase. Another carved a prayer hall. A third expanded the sanctuary. Centuries passed. What began as a lonely cave gradually transformed into an extraordinary complex clinging to the mountainside. There was rarely one dramatic moment when everything appeared overnight. Instead, history unfolded patiently, stone by stone, beam by beam, prayer by prayer. Nature itself influenced many decisions. Vertical cliffs offered protection unavailable on flat land. Steep rock walls discouraged invading armies. Floodwaters couldn't easily reach buildings perched hundreds of feet above river valleys. Wild animals generally preferred easier routes as well. Even landslides occasionally passed beneath elevated structures. If builders selected stable sections of stone, ironically, the most dangerous-looking locations sometimes proved surprisingly secure, at least once construction actually finished. Getting there was another matter entirely. Workers had to transport timber, food, water, stone, iron tools, ropes, and countless other supplies up narrow paths that often barely existed. Every beam represented days of labor before construction even began. Every stone had already completed an exhausting journey simply to reach the building site. Modern construction companies rely on cranes, trucks, elevators, helicopters, and power tools. Ancient builders relied on determination and an astonishing number of ropes. Good rope was worth its weight in opportunity. Entire projects depended upon it. A single failure could send valuable materials tumbling into the valley below, forcing workers to begin again. Nobody celebrated those days. Yet despite every challenge, generations continued building higher. Why? Because impossible places inspired extraordinary devotion. The struggle itself carried meaning. Every difficult climb reminded pilgrims that spiritual growth rarely followed the easiest road. Every carefully carved staircase represented persistence. Every suspended walkway demonstrated trust. By the time worshippers finally reached the temple entrance, they had already completed a physical journey that mirrored an inner one. Their tired legs became part of the ritual. Their careful breathing became preparation for quiet reflection. Their arrival felt earned. Perhaps that's one reason these remarkable temples continue to fascinate us today. They aren't impressive only because they're beautiful. They are impressive because they exist at all. Every beam challenges common sense. Every balcony seems to ignore gravity. Every stone asks the same silent question. How did they manage this? As we'll soon discover, the answer wasn't magic. It wasn't secret lost technology. It wasn't the work of mythical giants. It was something far more remarkable. Patient observation, ingenious engineering, thousands upon thousands of ordinary people working together over many decades. And all of it began with one extraordinary decision: to look at an impossible cliff and see not an obstacle, but the perfect place to build a temple. Chapter 2. Choosing the perfect mountain before a single stone could be carved. Before the first wooden beam was lifted, before monks chanted blessings over the future sanctuary, someone had to answer a surprisingly important question. Which mountain? Not every towering cliff was suitable. To an untrained traveler, one rocky mountain might look very much like another. Tall, gray, slightly intimidating. The sort of place where your knees begin protesting halfway up the trail. Ancient engineers, however, saw something completely different. They weren't looking for the tallest mountain or the most dramatic one. They were looking for the right one. That search could take months, sometimes years, because choosing the wrong mountain didn't simply create an inconvenient construction project. It could doom the entire temple before the first wall was ever completed. Imagine standing in a narrow valley thousands of years ago. There are no detailed maps, no satellite images, no drones quietly buzzing overhead, no geological survey reports waiting in a neat folder. Only your eyes, your experience, and generations of knowledge passed from one master builder to the next. The mountain stood silently before them, but silence didn't mean it revealed nothing. Experienced builders learned to read landscapes the way sailors read the sea. Every crack told a story. Every ledge hinted at hidden strengths or dangerous weaknesses. Every layer of exposed rock carried clues about what rested deep inside the mountain. Some cliffs appeared strong from a distance but concealed fractured stone that could crumble under pressure. Others looked rough and broken, yet possessed incredibly solid foundations beneath their weathered surfaces. The mountain was constantly speaking. The builders simply knew how to listen. One of the first concerns was the quality of the rock itself. Hard stone offered stability. Soft stone was easier to carve. Neither option was perfect. Granite could support enormous weight, but demanded years of exhausting labor. Sandstone yielded more willingly to iron chisels, but careless excavation could weaken entire sections of the cliff. Limestone occupied a comfortable middle ground in many regions, providing both durability and workable surfaces. Choosing the right stone meant balancing strength against practicality. Even then, nature always reserved the final vote. Water presented another challenge. Not too much, not too little. A mountain needed reliable springs or nearby streams to support the workers who might spend decades living there. Without water, construction stopped. Simple as that. Every mason needed to drink. Every cook needed clean water. Animals hauling supplies required it as well. Even the strongest engineer eventually admits defeat without something to fill a water jar. Yet too much water created different dangers. Hidden underground streams slowly weakened rock. Constant seepage caused cracks to widen during freezing winters. Heavy rainfall increased the risk of landslides. The perfect mountain managed water carefully, almost as though nature itself had become an architect. Ancient surveyors also paid close attention to sunlight. Morning sunlight warmed cold cliff faces after long nights. Afternoon shade protected wooden structures from relentless heat. Some temples deliberately faced the rising sun, allowing the first light of dawn to illuminate sacred statues inside. Others aligned with seasonal events. On certain mornings, each year, sunlight traveled through carefully planned openings before striking a single altar. The effect must have seemed almost magical. Of course, achieving that magic required astonishing mathematical precision. Ancient builders were excellent at making difficult calculations appear effortless. The mountain's shape mattered just as much. A perfectly smooth cliff looked impressive, but it offered almost nowhere to build. Builders preferred natural ledges, small shelves, rocky terraces, places where temporary scaffolding could stand. Every natural platform reduced weeks of dangerous work. Even a ledge, only a few feet wide, could become the foundation for an entire construction phase. Sometimes, what looked like random bumps on the mountainside became priceless gifts from geology. Accessibility also mattered. Now, accessible meant something very different in the ancient world. No one expected comfortable roads. Nobody asked whether wagons could park nearby. If a narrow mountain path existed at all, builders considered themselves fortunate. Still, they avoided locations that were completely impossible to reach. Thousands of workers needed food every day. Timber had to arrive. Stone blocks had to move uphill. Iron tools required constant replacement. Someone eventually had to carry every single nail, rope, basket, and cooking pot up the mountain. That reality encouraged practical thinking. Even deeply spiritual projects needed reliable supply lines. The surrounding landscape received careful attention as well. Could enemies approach unnoticed? Would smoke from kitchens remain hidden or reveal the monastery's location? Did nearby forests provide enough timber for decades of construction? Were their villages close enough to supply labor, but far enough away to preserve peaceful isolation? Every answer shaped the final decision. Then there were the less measurable considerations, sacred traditions, legends, dreams, visions. Many mountains already possessed powerful reputations. Long before engineers arrived, local villagers might tell stories of mysterious lights appearing near the summit. Hunters claimed unusual echoes answered their voices. Travelers described strange feelings of calm after spending a night among the cliffs. Whether these stories reflected genuine spiritual experiences or simply the powerful atmosphere of remote mountains hardly mattered. People believed them, and belief itself carried tremendous influence. Religious leaders often visited potential sites personally. Some meditated there for days. Others fasted while seeking guidance. A few reportedly chose locations after interpreting unusual natural events. An eagle circling overhead, an unexpected rainbow, a spring discovered where none had been expected. To modern readers, these choices may sound symbolic. To ancient communities, they represented meaningful signs. Engineering and faith frequently walked side by side. One selected the mountain, The other explained why that mountain mattered. Once the location was finally chosen, celebrations often followed, not because construction had finished, because it had finally begun. Selecting the mountain was, in many ways, the hardest decision. Everything afterward depended upon getting that first choice exactly right. Workers established temporary camps near the base. Surveyors measured distances using ropes, wooden poles, and remarkable patience. Stonecutters examined the cliff face, carpenters prepared timber, blacksmiths sharpened chisels until their edges gleamed in the morning sun. Monks offered prayers for safety. Everyone understood the scale of what lay ahead. Years of labor, perhaps decades, maybe even an entire lifetime, yet standing together at the foot of that immense cliff, they didn't see an impossible wall of stone. They saw possibility. They imagined halls where only solid rock existed, balconies overlooking valleys that had never known human footsteps, wooden walkways suspended between earth and sky, sanctuaries where silence would someday replace the echo of hammers. The mountain remained exactly as it had been for millions of years, patient, unmoving, almost indifferent. But from that moment onward, its story became forever intertwined with the people determined to transform a cliff into a place of worship. And in our next chapter, those remarkable builders will begin solving perhaps the greatest challenge of all. How do you measure, design, and plan an impossible temple before lifting the very first stone? Chapter 3, Ancient Surveyors and Geometry, long before the first chisel struck the cliff, before the first rope was tied, before the first timber reached the mountainside. There was another group of remarkable people quietly beginning their work, the surveyors. They rarely appear in ancient legends. Kings rarely built statues in their honor. Nobody composed heroic poems about the man who spent 6 months measuring angles with a length of rope. History can be surprisingly unfair, because without these quiet mathematicians and master planners, none of the breathtaking cliff temples we've admired for centuries would have survived their first winter. Imagine arriving at the base of a towering mountain nearly 2,000 years ago. The cliff stretches hundreds of feet into the sky. Its surface twists, bends, and leans at unpredictable angles. From below, it looks almost impossible to understand, but to an experienced surveyor, it isn't just a mountain. It's a giant puzzle. Every crack, every ledge, every overhanging rock, every hidden cave, each one must be measured, recorded, and understood before construction can even be imagined. Today, engineers would unpack laser scanners, GPS receivers, drones, computers, capable of creating detailed three-dimensional models within hours. Ancient surveyors had none of these luxuries. Instead, they carried ropes, wooden poles, plumb bobs made from stone or bronze, measuring rods, wax tablets, charcoal, remarkably sharp eyes, and generations of accumulated experience. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. One of their simplest tools was also one of their most effective: a weighted string, known today as a plumb line. Suspend a stone from a cord, and gravity performs the difficult part. The string points perfectly downward every single time. Simple, reliable, almost impossible to improve upon. Modern skyscrapers still use the same principle. Sometimes the oldest technology refuses to become obsolete. Surveyors climbed carefully across narrow ledges, lowering plumb lines over cliff edges to determine just how vertical the rock truly was. Not every cliff leaned at the same angle. Some curved inward, others bulged outward. A difference of only a few degrees could completely change an engineer's construction plans. One mistaken measurement might place an entire temple directly beneath unstable rock. That was not the sort of surprise anyone wanted halfway through a 30-year building project. Distance came next. Without measuring tapes stretching hundreds of feet, ancient engineers relied upon carefully knotted ropes. Each knot represented a standard unit of length. Teams stretched these ropes across flat ground whenever possible, recording surprisingly accurate measurements. Even uneven terrain couldn't stop them. They divided large distances into smaller sections, measuring one piece at a time before combining everything into a complete survey. Slow, absolutely effective. Without question, geometry became their silent partner. Although many workers may never have used the word geometry, they practiced it every day. Angles determined whether staircases remained safe. Proportions ensured columns supported roofs evenly. Symmetry created beauty almost effortlessly. An experienced builder could often recognize tiny mistakes simply by looking at a structure from across the valley. The human eye notices imbalance remarkably well. Ancient architects understood this long before psychology attempted to explain it. One fascinating technique involved nothing more complicated than wooden stakes and rope. By stretching cords tightly between fixed points, surveyors created perfectly straight reference lines. Additional ropes formed triangles. Those triangles became temporary maps floating above the ground. Unlike squares or rectangles, triangles resisted distortion. Pull one corner, and the shape remained stable. Ancient builders trusted triangles because nature trusted them too. Bridge builders, shipwrights, temple designers, they all discovered the same lesson. Triangles rarely argue with gravity. Working on cliffs demanded even greater precision. Imagine carving a horizontal platform into a mountainside. If one end sits only a few inches lower than the other, rainwater collects where it shouldn't. Wooden beams shift, stone walls gradually crack. Small errors quietly become enormous problems. Surveyors knew this, so they checked, and checked again, then probably checked one more time, simply to sleep better that night. Patience often proved more valuable than speed. Many survey teams spent weeks studying the same cliff before marking a single construction line. They observed how sunlight moved across the rock, where water flowed after rainfall, which sections remained dry, which areas echoed strangely when struck with a hammer. Those echoes mattered. Solid stone produced sharp, confident sounds. Hidden cracks answered differently. Experienced ears could hear weaknesses invisible to the eye. It almost resembled giving the mountain a medical examination. Except the patient weighed several billion tons. Ancient Chinese builders, Indian rock-cut architects, and craftsmen throughout Asia developed remarkably sophisticated surveying traditions. Although separated by geography and culture, many reached similar conclusions. Measure carefully, trust experience, respect the mountain, never assume. The mountain usually wins arguments. Some temples aligned precisely with the rising sun during important religious festivals. Others faced sacred rivers, winding through distant valleys. Certain entrances framed nearby peaks so perfectly that visitors experienced breathtaking views the moment they stepped outside. None of these alignments happened by accident. They resulted from careful planning, patient observation, and astonishing mathematical skill. Imagine standing on a narrow ledge at sunrise every morning for several weeks, simply recording where the sunlight first touched the opposite mountain. Ancient surveyors actually did things like that, not because they enjoyed waking before dawn. Well, perhaps some unusually cheerful people did, but because sacred architecture demanded extraordinary precision. Even shadows became measuring tools. By observing the changing length of a pole's shadow throughout the day, surveyors estimated directions, seasonal changes, and solar movement. The sun itself became part of their equipment. Nature freely provided one of history's oldest engineering instruments. Master builders also prepared scale drawings whenever possible. Some scratched plans into smooth stone. Others drew on wooden boards or parchment. Nothing fancy. Simple lines, basic measurements, carefully calculated proportions. Enough information to guide years of construction. Imagine creating architectural blueprints that your grandchildren might still be using decades later. That required remarkable confidence and remarkably clear handwriting. Poor handwriting has frustrated construction workers for thousands of years. Some traditions never disappear. Communication between surveyors and craftsmen proved equally important. A perfectly measured design meant very little if stonecutters misunderstood the instructions. Experienced masters spent countless hours explaining plans, demonstrating angles, marking reference points, teaching apprentices how every measurement connected to the larger vision. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next, not through textbooks, but through conversations, careful demonstrations, patient corrections, and years of shared labor. Perhaps the most extraordinary achievement wasn't any individual measurement, it was consistency. Construction sometimes lasted 50 years, occasionally 100. Workers changed. Kings died. Monks grew old. Empires rose and fell. Yet somehow, the measurements remained accurate enough that each new generation continued exactly where the previous one had stopped. That kind of continuity is astonishing. It required trust, organization, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to precision. Today, visitors often admire the graceful wooden balconies, elegant halls, and dramatic cliffside views. Few stop to appreciate the invisible geometry hidden beneath every beam, the carefully calculated angles, the perfectly balanced proportions. The surveyor's quiet fingerprints left not in stone, but in mathematics, because before ancient engineers conquered gravity, before they lifted a single piece of timber toward the clouds, they first conquered something equally important: uncertainty. With little more than rope, simple tools, careful observation, and extraordinary patience, they transformed an unpredictable mountainside into a carefully measured blueprint. And now that every angle had been checked, every distance recorded, and every foundation marked, The real challenge could finally begin. The mountain had been measured. Now it had to be climbed. Chapter 4: Moving Stone Without Machines. The plans had been drawn. The mountain had been measured. The surveyors had done their careful work, checking angles so many times that they probably started dreaming in straight lines and perfect triangles. Now came the part everyone had been quietly avoiding: actually moving the stone. It sounds like a simple enough task. Take a block of rock from one place, carry it to another, build a temple. Unfortunately, these weren't ordinary rocks. Some weighed hundreds of pounds. Others tipped the scales at several tons. And just to make things interesting, the destination wasn't across a flat field. It was halfway up a cliff. Ancient builders didn't have diesel trucks. They didn't have forklifts. They didn't have hydraulic cranes capable of lifting dozens of tons with the push of a button. What they did have was something far less glamorous: human determination. Lots of rope, an impressive collection of wooden tools, and an almost unbelievable amount of patience. The first challenge wasn't climbing the mountain. It was finding the right stone. Builders searched nearby quarries whenever possible. The closer the quarry, the better. Every extra mile meant hundreds of additional trips for workers and pack animals. Sometimes they were fortunate. A suitable layer of stone lay only a short distance away. Other times, nature was considerably less cooperative. Entire teams traveled for days, searching for rock that possessed just the right balance of strength and workability. Once the quarry was chosen, another problem appeared: removing enormous blocks from solid bedrock. Iron chisels struck the surface again and again. Heavy hammers echoed through the valley. Wooden wedges were driven into narrow cracks. Then workers poured water onto the dry wood. Slowly, the wedges absorbed moisture. They expanded. Tiny cracks widened. Hours later, sometimes even days later, the mountain surrendered another block of stone. No explosions, no roaring machinery, just physics, patiently doing its work, one careful strike at a time. Freshly cut blocks rarely resembled finished building stones. That would have made transportation far too difficult. Instead, masons often shaped them partially at the quarry, removing unnecessary weight before the long journey uphill. Every pound saved meant less strain on ropes, less effort for workers, and fewer opportunities for gravity to demonstrate why it remains undefeated. Then came transportation. On level ground, workers placed heavy stones onto wooden sledges instead of wheels, which often struggled on rough terrain. These sledges slid across prepared pathways. The roads themselves became engineering projects. Workers cleared rocks, filled holes, laid down smooth logs. Sometimes they spread wet clay beneath the sledges, sometimes sand, sometimes leaves soaked with water. Anything that reduced friction. Hundreds of hands grasped thick ropes. At the signal, everyone pulled together. Slowly, the enormous stone began to move. Not quickly, not dramatically, perhaps only a few inches at first, but movement was movement. A supervisor watched carefully. If one side moved faster than the other, he shouted instructions. If a rope stretched too tightly, everything stopped. Replacing a broken rope was far easier than replacing several injured workers. Progress demanded discipline, not speed. Ancient construction sites were surprisingly organized. Every worker knew his position. Some pulled, others pushed. Several monitored the ropes. Experienced foremen walked alongside the stone, constantly watching for signs of danger. Communication mattered enormously. One poorly timed pull could twist the entire load. That might damage the stone, or much worse. As the route reached steeper slopes, simple sledges became less useful. Builders adapted. Wooden rollers appeared beneath the load. As the stone moved forward, workers collected the rollers from behind and carried them to the front again and again and again. It was repetitive work, the sort of task that modern people might describe as monotonous. Ancient laborers simply called it Tuesday. Sometimes oxen joined the effort. Strong, patient animals pulled where terrain allowed. Mules carried smaller stones along narrow mountain trails. In certain regions, elephants assisted with the heaviest loads. Their immense strength transformed impossible tasks into merely exhausting ones. Even so, animals could only climb so far. Eventually, the mountain became too steep. From that point onward, human ingenuity took over. Engineers built temporary ramps from packed earth, timber, and loose stone. These ramps snaked around the mountainside, reducing the steepness of the climb. A longer path required more distance, but much less force. Ancient builders understood something every experienced hiker knows. The easiest route to the top is rarely the straightest one. Some ramps remained in place for years. Others disappeared after a single construction season. When one section of the temple was completed, workers dismantled the ramp and built another higher up the cliff. The mountain slowly transformed into a giant staircase of temporary engineering. Of course, ramps alone couldn't solve every problem. Certain cliff faces offered no room at all, nothing but empty air beneath towering walls of stone. This was where ropes became the true heroes of the story. Massive hemp ropes, braided plant fibers, animal hide lashings, each one carefully inspected before use. Entire communities specialized in making rope. Good rope saved lives. Poor rope became history for all the wrong reasons. Large wooden tripods appeared near dangerous sections. Simple cranes, powered entirely by human muscles, lifted smaller blocks upward. Groups of workers walked backward while pulling ropes over wooden pulleys. The stone rose slowly, sometimes only a few feet per hour. Nobody complained. Slow lifting was safe lifting. Gravity never became impatient. Neither did experienced engineers. Every evening the load was secured before workers rested. Nobody trusted a suspended stone overnight. Imagine trying to sleep beneath several tons of rock, held up by nothing more than timber and rope. Ancient builders preferred certainty. Wise decision. Sometimes construction paused completely during storms. Heavy rain transformed mountain paths into slippery ribbons of mud. Strong winds turned suspended loads into dangerous swinging pendulums. Winter ice created hazards everywhere. Nature dictated the schedule. No king, not even the most powerful emperor, could order a mountain to stop being a mountain. Food presented another challenge. Hundreds of workers burned enormous amounts of energy every day. Grain, rice, barley, vegetables, dried meat, fresh water, everything had to travel uphill as well. Building a temple wasn't merely transporting stone. It meant transporting an entire temporary village. Blacksmiths repaired damaged tools. Carpenters replaced broken sledges. Cooks prepared meals. Doctors treated injuries. Priests offered encouragement. Children sometimes carried messages between camps. Construction sites became bustling, little communities balanced against impossible landscapes. Years passed, sometimes decades. One carefully moved stone became 10. 10 became 100. 100 became thousands. Visitors arriving midway through construction would have seen organized chaos, workers shouting instructions, hammers ringing against stone, oxen straining against heavy sledges, clouds of dust rising into the morning sunlight, and, high above, the unfinished temple slowly taking shape. Perhaps the greatest misconception about ancient engineering is the idea that builders possessed some mysterious, lost technology. The reality is almost more impressive. They didn't rely on secret machines. They relied on careful planning, teamwork, experience passed through generations, an intimate understanding of weight, balance, friction, and gravity. They couldn't defeat the laws of physics, so they learned to work with them, stone by stone, rope by rope, step by patient step. Looking at these cliffside temples today, it's easy to admire the finished buildings, the polished halls, the elegant columns, the peaceful balconies overlooking distant valleys, but every beautiful stone resting quietly in its final place once endured an extraordinary journey, dragged, lifted, pulled, balanced, protected, moved inch by painstaking inch, by ordinary people whose names have almost entirely vanished from history. Their muscles have long since turned to dust. Their voices faded centuries ago. Yet the temples they built still cling to the mountainsides, silently reminding us that some of humanity's greatest achievements weren't accomplished through impossible inventions, but through extraordinary perseverance. In our next chapter, however, moving stone will seem almost easy, because once the materials finally reach the cliff, ancient engineers faced an even greater challenge. How do you build scaffolding when there's almost no ground beneath your feet? Chapter 5, Building Scaffolding. In midair by now, the mountain had begun to change. Thousands of stones had slowly climbed upward. Heavy timber rested on narrow ledges. Temporary camps buzzed quietly with the sounds of hammers, chisels, and evening conversations drifting through the cool mountain air. The impossible was beginning to look slightly less impossible. But then the builders reached another problem, a rather inconvenient one. There was nowhere left to stand. On a normal construction site, workers simply built scaffolding from the ground upward. Simple enough. You plant sturdy posts into the earth, connect them with horizontal beams, add platforms, and climb higher as the building grows. On the side of a nearly vertical cliff, there was no earth, only empty air, which meant ancient engineers faced an astonishing question. How do you build a platform when the platform itself has nowhere to begin? This was where centuries of practical experience met extraordinary creativity. The first task was finding trustworthy rock. Not every section of the cliff could support scaffolding. Surveyors returned once again, carefully examining every crack, every natural ledge, and every solid face of stone. Experienced masons tapped the rock gently with iron hammers. A clear, ringing sound usually suggested strong, solid stone. A dull echo invited caution. The mountain, once again, quietly revealed its secrets to those willing to listen. Once suitable locations were chosen, workers began drilling holes directly into the cliff. No electric drills, no compressed air, only iron chisels, heavy hammers, and remarkable endurance. Hour after hour, strike after strike, small holes slowly appeared in the mountainside. These openings became the anchors for enormous wooden beams. Each beam was carefully shaped before being lifted into position. Sometimes it took dozens of workers pulling ropes together just to raise a single timber. With incredible patience, the beam slid into its prepared socket. Then builders secured it tightly, using wedges driven into the surrounding rock. The result was surprisingly strong instead of resting on the ground. The beam projected straight out from the cliff like the branch of an enormous tree. Another beam followed, then another. Soon, a network of wooden supports stretched into open space. Platforms were laid across the beams. Ropes secured every joint. Slowly, very slowly, a working floor appeared, where moments earlier there had been nothing but sky. Standing on those platforms required confidence, and perhaps a healthy ability not to look down. Modern construction workers wear steel harnesses attached to sophisticated safety systems. Ancient builders relied upon balance, experience, carefully tied ropes, and complete trust in the carpenter who built yesterday's platform. Fortunately, those carpenters took their responsibilities very seriously. A poorly built scaffold endangered everyone, not just one worker. Entire teams depended upon each timber, remaining exactly where it belonged. Inspections became part of everyday life. Every morning, experienced supervisors walked across the scaffolding before work began. They examined joints, tested ropes, listened for unusual creaks, checked wedges driven into the rock. Even tiny movements attracted immediate attention. If something seemed uncertain, work stopped. Repairs came first. Schedules came second. The mountain wasn't interested in deadlines. Temporary stairways connected different levels of the scaffolding. Some were little more than rough, wooden ladders tied together with thick rope. Others consisted of narrow planks, fastened directly to the cliff. Climbing them demanded careful concentration. Carrying heavy tools while doing so required even greater skill. Imagine ascending several hundred feet with a basket of iron chisels balanced on your shoulder. One careless step, and gravity would quickly remind everyone why ancient builders respected it so deeply. Yet, astonishingly, many workers developed such confidence that these dizzying heights became ordinary. The first few weeks may have been terrifying. Months later, the platforms felt almost familiar. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt, even to places that seem completely unnatural. Weather, however, never stopped creating new challenges. Mountain winds arrived without warning. A calm morning could become a gusty afternoon within minutes. Loose tools rolled toward platform edges. Dust filled the air. Suspended ropes swayed gently back and forth. During particularly strong winds, Foremen often ordered everyone to descend. No stone was worth gambling against nature. Rain presented different problems. Wet timber became slippery. Heavy wooden beams expanded slightly as they absorbed moisture. Ropes stretched. Mist reduced visibility until workers could barely see companions only a short distance away. Many construction sites simply paused during severe weather. Patience remained one of the most valuable engineering tools ever invented. Interestingly, scaffolding wasn't always discarded once construction finished. In some cliff temples, the wooden beams supporting temporary work platforms eventually became permanent structural elements. Rather than removing them, builders integrated them into balconies, walkways, and elevated corridors. Visitors today occasionally notice ancient timber protruding from cliff walls and wonder why it remains there. In many cases, those beams once supported the very workers who built the temple itself. It's almost as though the scaffolding became part of the monument, a quiet reminder of the journey behind the finished masterpiece. Communication across these towering work sites demanded creativity. Voices disappeared into the wind. Echoes bounced unpredictably between cliffs. Simple signals evolved. A raised hand, a tug on a rope, a wooden mallet striking timber a certain number of times. Experienced crews understood these signals immediately. Words weren't always necessary. Sometimes silence proved more efficient. As construction climbed higher, scaffolding climbed with it. Platforms were dismantled below and rebuilt above. The mountain slowly filled with an ever-changing forest of wooden beams. Nothing remained permanent except the temple itself. Everything else existed only long enough to help create something greater. It's a beautiful idea. Really, temporary structures making permanent beauty possible. There was another remarkable feature of these ancient platforms: flexibility. Modern buildings often rely on rigid steel frameworks. Ancient timber possessed a small but valuable advantage. It could bend slightly. During strong winds or minor earthquakes, wooden scaffolding absorbed movement instead of resisting it completely. Builders may not have described this using modern engineering terms, but generations of practical experience taught them what worked. Wood lived, stone endured. Together they formed an unexpectedly resilient partnership. As weeks turned into years, workers grew intimately familiar with the mountainside. They recognized individual rock formations, named unusual ledges, remembered where hawks nested each spring, knew which platforms received the first morning sunlight. The mountain gradually transformed from an intimidating obstacle into something almost like a companion, demanding, unpredictable, occasionally dangerous, but ultimately respected. Looking back, today, it's tempting to imagine these cliffside construction projects as impossible feats achieved through mysterious lost knowledge. The truth is both simpler and more inspiring. They succeeded because ordinary people solved extraordinary problems, one careful step at a time. When the ground disappeared, they built new ground. When the cliff offered no place to stand, they created one, and every new platform carried them just a little closer to the sanctuary they imagined high above the valley. Yet even these remarkable wooden structures represented only half the challenge. because beams alone couldn't lift enormous building materials hundreds of feet into the air. For that, ancient engineers relied upon another invention, so simple that it still appears on construction sites around the world today. The humble rope. In our next chapter, we'll discover how ancient craftsmen transformed bundles of plant fibers into lifelines capable of lifting stone, supporting workers, and making some of history's most breathtaking cliffside temples possible. Chapter 6: Rope Technology and Pulley Systems. By now, the temple had begun to emerge from the mountainside. Stone platforms stretched into empty space. Wooden scaffolding clung to the cliff like an enormous spider's web. The sound of hammers echoed through the valley from sunrise until dusk. But every evening, when the tools were put away and the mountain grew quiet once more, one humble object remained everywhere, coiled neatly beside unfinished walls, wrapped around timber, hanging from wooden beams, looped over temporary cranes, tied around bundles of stone, fastened to workers' waists. Rope, not gold, not iron, not marble, just rope. It rarely receives the attention it deserves. Kings received statues, architects received admiration, temples attracted pilgrims from distant lands. The rope simply kept everyone alive. History has a curious habit of overlooking the quiet heroes. Without reliable rope, almost every cliffside temple would have remained an ambitious sketch scratched into a wax tablet. Because once construction reached hundreds of feet above the valley floor, nothing moved without it. Imagine standing at the foot of the mountain early one morning. The sun has barely climbed above the eastern hills. Mist still curls through the valley below. High overhead, workers are already waiting on narrow wooden platforms. A massive timber rests at the bottom of the cliff. It must somehow reach them. No engines, no electric winches, no steel cables, only human hands, and carefully braided fibers. Making strong rope was an art in itself. Entire families specialized in it. Across Asia, builders experimented with hemp, flax, rami, bamboo fibers, palm fibers, and other remarkably tough plants. In some regions, strips of animal hide strengthened critical lifting ropes. Every strand was twisted carefully, then twisted again with other strands, finally braided into thick cables capable of supporting astonishing loads. The process demanded patience. One weak section, hidden inside hundreds of feet of rope, could spell disaster. Master rope makers inspected every finished coil with almost obsessive attention. They bent it, pulled it, twisted it, ran experienced fingers across every inch. Tiny imperfections rarely escaped notice. A rope wasn't simply another tool, it was a promise. A promise that everyone standing hundreds of feet above the ground would return home that evening. Naturally, no sensible engineer trusted just one rope. Whenever possible, important loads were supported by several. If one failed, another remained. Redundancy may sound like a modern engineering principle. Ancient builders understood it perfectly well. They simply learned it through experience instead of textbooks. As construction climbed higher, builders encountered another challenge. Even the strongest workers could lift only so much weight. Muscles have limits. Stone generally ignores those limits, so ancient engineers turned to one of humanity's oldest mechanical inventions. The pulley, a wonderfully simple idea. Pass a rope over a smooth wooden wheel. Instead of lifting straight upward, workers could pull downward while gravity quietly assisted the process. Even better, by combining several pulleys into what we now call a block and tackle system, builders dramatically reduced the force needed to raise heavy materials. The trade-off, of course, was time. Workers pulled much more rope to lift the load the same distance. Ancient engineers happily accepted that bargain. Time was plentiful. Dropped stones were expensive. Picture 20 men standing in a long line. Each grips a thick hemp rope. At the foreman's signal, they lean backward together. Not violently, not with frantic effort, but with slow, steady rhythm. The pulley creaks softly. The rope tightens. The heavy timber rises an inch, then another. Nobody celebrates too early. The mountain has taught them patience. Every few feet, the load stops. Workers check the knots, inspect the wooden pulley, examine the supporting beams. Only after everything appears secure does the climb continue. It may take an entire morning to lift one massive beam. No one complains. Everyone understands that slow work is safe work. Ancient construction sites often sounded remarkably musical, not because musicians entertained the laborers, although that occasionally happened during festivals. The rhythm came from the work itself, the steady creak of rope, the tap of wooden wedges, the scrape of sledges, the foreman's calm commands. Groups pulling together often counted aloud or sang simple work songs. The rhythm helped everyone pull at exactly the same moment. 20 people working together could accomplish far more than 20 people acting separately. Synchronization became another engineering tool. The ropes themselves required constant care. Sunlight gradually weakened natural fibers. Rain encouraged rot. Dust worked its way between twisted strands. Every evening, experienced workers cleaned the ropes as carefully as blacksmiths sharpened their chisels. Damaged sections were repaired immediately. Severely worn ropes were retired before they became dangerous. It may seem wasteful. Replacing a rope was always cheaper than replacing a life. Ancient builders also understood something modern engineers still respect. Knots matter. A poorly tied knot can reduce a rope's strength dramatically. A properly tied one distributes tension evenly. Certain master craftsmen became famous not for carving stone, but for tying knots so reliable that entire construction teams trusted them without hesitation. Imagine earning your reputation because nobody questioned your knots. It's not the sort of fame poets usually celebrate, yet countless temples quietly depended upon exactly that skill. The cliff itself became part of the lifting system. Engineers anchored ropes around enormous boulders, sturdy trees, or heavy wooden posts driven deep into the ground. Sometimes they drilled anchor holes directly into solid rock. The mountain helped lift the very stones used to transform it. There is something beautifully poetic about that. Of course, not every day unfolded smoothly. Sometimes a sudden gust of wind caused a suspended beam to swing dangerously. Sometimes a pulley wheel cracked under years of strain. Occasionally, a rope snapped with a sharp report that echoed across the valley. Those moments were terrifying. Everyone froze. Then came silence, followed by immediate inspection. ancient builders never ignored warnings from their equipment. A single failure taught lessons that entire generations remembered. Experience became tradition. Tradition became engineering. Communication remained essential during every lift. Workers stationed high above couldn't always hear those below. Instead, teams developed simple signals: one tug on the rope, two sharp knocks with a wooden mallet, a raised flag, a blast from a horn. Each signal carried a specific meaning: lift, stop, lower slowly, danger. These quiet languages of construction allowed hundreds of people to work together with remarkable precision. As the years passed, some workers became astonishingly skilled. Experienced riggers could estimate the weight of a stone simply by watching how a rope stretched beneath it. They recognized unusual sounds instantly. A healthy rope produced one kind of creak. An overloaded one whispered a completely different warning. Their knowledge rarely appeared in written manuals. It lived inside memory, passed from father to son, master to apprentice, one careful demonstration at a time. Today, when visitors stand beneath an ancient hanging temple and gaze upward in amazement, they usually admire the graceful architecture, the sweeping roofs, the carved pillars, the breathtaking location. Few notice the invisible engineering that once surrounded every stage of construction. The ropes are gone. The temporary pulleys disappeared centuries ago. The work songs faded into silence long before any of us were born. Yet every stone resting peacefully above our heads once trusted those simple systems completely, not because they were magical, not because ancient builders possessed forgotten super technology, but because ordinary people understood one timeless truth: the smartest engineer isn't always the one with the most complicated machine. Sometimes, it's the one who knows exactly how to use the simplest one. And as the temple climbed ever higher into the clouds, another challenge quietly emerged. The builders themselves now had to live on the mountain for months, sometimes years, balancing ordinary daily life with one of history's most extraordinary construction projects. That is where our journey goes next. We'll leave the ropes behind and step into the temporary mountain villages where the builders ate, slept, laughed, worried, and slowly transformed impossible dreams into enduring stone. Chapter 7: Life of the Cliff Builders. This point in our journey, we've spent a great deal of time admiring the engineering, the carefully measured cliffs, the ingenious scaffolding, the ropes that quietly carried impossible weights toward the clouds. But tonight, I'd like to leave the blueprints behind for a while, because buildings, no matter how magnificent, don't construct themselves. Every stone in these hanging temples was touched by human hands, hands that grew calloused, hands that ached after long days of work, hands that belonged not to famous emperors or legendary generals, but to ordinary people whose names have almost entirely disappeared from history. If you had climbed the mountain during construction, you probably wouldn't have met a king. You would have met a carpenter eating a simple breakfast, a young apprentice sharpening iron chisels, a cook stirring a large pot over a smoky fire, a rope maker carefully inspecting yesterday's work, a monk quietly sweeping dust from an unfinished prayer hall. These were the people who truly built the mountain temples. and their lives were far less glamorous than the temples they left behind. Long before sunrise, the camps slowly came alive. The first sounds were rarely hammers. Instead, you would hear crackling firewood, the gentle clatter of clay bowls, soft conversations carried through the cool mountain air. Someone coughed after sleeping beside a smoky fire. Someone else stretched sore shoulders before another demanding day. High above the valley, mornings arrived differently. Clouds drifted below the camps instead of above them. The rising sun painted distant peaks in warm shades of gold, while the valleys remained wrapped in pale mist. It was breathtaking and completely ordinary for the people living there. Human beings have an incredible talent for becoming accustomed to extraordinary views. Breakfast was simple: rice in many parts of Asia, millet where the climate favored it, barley in colder regions, sometimes vegetables, occasionally dried fish, perhaps a little fruit when the season allowed. No elaborate banquets, no endless variety. The goal wasn't luxury, it was energy. Moving stone all day requires a surprising number of calories. Even after breakfast, work didn't begin immediately. Tools had to be checked, ropes inspected, scaffolding examined. Experienced foremen walked the construction site each morning, searching for loose planks, cracked beams, or signs that yesterday's rain had changed the mountain in some subtle way. The mountain never stopped changing. The workers never stopped paying attention. Construction crews were surprisingly diverse. There were master stonemasons whose experience stretched back decades, young apprentices barely old enough to grow a beard, carpenters shaping enormous timbers with remarkable precision, blacksmiths repairing worn chisels and bent hammers, laborers carrying baskets of gravel, rope makers constantly replacing worn fibers, animal handlers caring for oxen and mules, water carriers climbing steep paths countless times each day, cooks, messengers, monks, healers. Every person contributed something essential. Without the cook, the mason couldn't work. Without the blacksmith, the carpenter lost his tools. Without the rope maker, nobody lifted anything. Great monuments are rarely the achievement of one brilliant individual. They're usually the result of thousands of ordinary people performing their jobs exceptionally well. Naturally, not everyone received the same respect. Master craftsmen earned admiration because their mistakes affected entire structures. A poorly carved beam might weaken a roof. An inaccurate foundation could threaten the whole temple. Apprentices watched these experienced builders constantly. Learning wasn't confined to lessons. It happened through observation, quiet correction, patient repetition. Sometimes the master simply demonstrated the task again. Other times, the apprentice discovered the lesson after spending several hours fixing his own mistake. Ancient education could be remarkably memorable. The work itself was relentless. Stone dust settled into hair and clothing. Hands developed thick calluses. Shoulders ached from carrying timber. Feet grew accustomed to uneven mountain paths. By evening, most workers were exhausted. Yet tomorrow promised another day exactly like today. Construction lasted years, sometimes decades. This wasn't temporary employment. For many families, it became a way of life. Some children grew up knowing no other home than the mountain camp. Imagine being born while the temple foundation was still under construction. and reaching adulthood before the roof was finished. That happened more often than we might expect. Life continued even as the temple slowly climbed higher. There were births, marriages, funerals, festivals, arguments over trivial matters, friendships that lasted lifetimes. History often focuses on monuments, but real life unfolded quietly around them. Weather shaped every season. Summer heat made climbing exhausting. Winter winds swept across exposed cliffs with astonishing force. Rain transformed narrow paths into slippery ribbons of mud. Dense fog sometimes surrounded the camps, so completely that workers could barely see the nearest platform. On those mornings, construction often paused. No one argued with the mountain. It had already proven that it always won. Injuries were inevitable. Splinters, bruises, strained muscles, cuts from sharp stone, occasionally broken bones. Experienced healers treated wounds using the knowledge available at the time. Herbal medicines eased pain. Bandages protected injuries. Rest, when possible, allowed the body to recover. Unfortunately, when possible, wasn't always as often as anyone would have liked. Still, one thing surprises many historians. Ancient builders were often remarkably careful. Popular imagination sometimes portrays historical construction as reckless chaos. The evidence suggests something different. Experienced foremen understood that injured workers delayed construction. Broken tools could be replaced. Skilled craftsmen could not. Safety wasn't motivated by modern regulations. It was motivated by common sense. Evenings brought a welcome change of pace. As daylight faded behind distant mountains, hammers gradually fell silent. Cooking fires flickered across the camps. The smell of warm food drifted through the cool evening air. Workers gathered together, sharing simple meals after another demanding day. Someone told stories. Another repaired worn clothing. A carpenter sharpened tomorrow's tools while chatting with old friends. Monks quietly recited prayers nearby. The mountain, so noisy during daylight, slowly returned to silence. Perhaps the most valuable thing these evenings offered wasn't food, it was community. Living high on a remote cliff demanded cooperation. People depended upon one another. If someone's roof leaked during heavy rain, neighbors helped repair it. If a worker fell ill, others carried his responsibilities for a while. If fresh supplies finally arrived from the valley, everyone celebrated. Even small victories mattered. Occasionally, traveling merchants reached the camps. Their arrival transformed an ordinary evening into an exciting event. New iron, fresh cloth, salt.tea oil. Perhaps even news from distant cities. For people who spent months among the mountains, stories from the outside world became valuable treasures. News traveled almost as slowly as the stone. Religion remained woven through daily life. Many workers believed they weren't merely building a structure, they were creating something sacred. Morning prayers often began the day's labor. Blessings accompanied important milestones. When a major beam was successfully lifted into place, quiet ceremonies sometimes marked the achievement. Faith provided purpose during difficult years. When exhaustion settled into aching muscles, when winter storms delayed progress, when another dangerous climb awaited at dawn, believing the work served something greater than oneself made the burden easier to carry. Perhaps the most touching aspect of these builders' lives is something history rarely records. Hope. The young apprentice hoped to become a master. The master hoped the temple would outlive him. Parents hoped their children would inherit useful skills. Monks hoped future generations would find peace within the sanctuary. No one knew whether travelers, centuries later, would still admire their work. They simply built as though someone would. And here we are, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of years later, quietly appreciating their patience, looking at the same cliffs, walking through the same halls, wondering about the people who once laughed, worked, worried, and dreamed upon these mountains. The builders themselves have long since disappeared. Their camps vanished. Their tools rusted away. Their voices became echoes carried off by the wind centuries ago. Yet, in a curious way, they never truly left. Every carefully fitted stone, every precisely carved beam, every staircase climbing patiently toward the clouds still carries a little piece of the ordinary people who created it. In our next chapter, we'll meet the remarkable master engineers whose vision transformed countless individual efforts into some of the most breathtaking hanging temples the ancient world had ever seen. Chapter 8: The Master Engineers as the mountain slowly surrendered to human determination. As thousands of stones found their places, as wooden platforms stretched farther into the open air, someone had to see the entire picture, not just today's task, not next week's challenge, but the finished temple, years before it actually existed. These people were the master engineers. History remembers surprisingly few of their names. Unlike kings, they rarely placed inscriptions celebrating themselves. Unlike famous generals, they didn't ride triumphantly through cities. Most lived quiet lives, surrounded by measuring ropes, sketches, timber, and an endless parade of questions from worried workers. Master, this beam doesn't quite fit. The cliff is softer than we expected. The rain washed away part of the ramp. The rope looks worn. The foundation shifted a little. Every problem eventually arrived at the engineer's feet. And unlike the mountain, the workers expected answers. Imagine carrying that responsibility. Hundreds of people looking toward you every morning, trusting that today's decisions won't become tomorrow's disaster. It required more than intelligence. It demanded patience, experience, calm judgment, and perhaps the ability to remain composed while someone informed you that several tons of carefully carved stone had just become stuck halfway up a cliff. Again, the master engineer wasn't simply an architect. He was part mathematician, part carpenter, part geologist, part manager, part teacher, sometimes even part diplomat. Construction brought together laborers, monks, craftsmen, merchants, local officials, and wealthy patrons. Keeping all those different groups working toward the same goal could be nearly as difficult as carving the mountain itself. A successful engineer understood people almost as well as stone. Many began their careers as apprentices, not in classrooms, but on construction sites. As young boys or teenagers, they carried tools, mixed mortar, measured timber, watched experienced builders solve problems one careful step at a time. Years passed before anyone trusted them with important decisions. Knowledge wasn't handed over in a single lesson. It accumulated slowly, like the temple itself. One beam, one measurement, one correction, One success, one mistake, carefully remembered. Ancient engineering schools, in the modern sense, rarely existed. Instead, the mountain became the classroom. A master might spend decades teaching only a handful of apprentices. Those students eventually became masters themselves. Generation after generation, knowledge quietly flowed forward without needing thick textbooks or complicated examinations. Experience remained the greatest teacher. One of the engineer's most remarkable abilities was visualization. Standing before an empty cliff, they had to imagine rooms that didn't yet exist. Balconies suspended over valleys, wooden corridors connecting separate chambers, roof lines following the natural curves of the mountain. It's rather like looking at a blank canvas and already seeing the completed painting, except your canvas weighs several million tons. Master engineers constantly balanced ambition with caution. A wealthy ruler might request something spectacular. Can we extend the balcony another 20 feet? Perhaps. But should they? That was an entirely different question. Good engineers knew when to refuse impossible ideas. Politely, of course. One generally avoided offending kings whenever possible. Instead of saying, "That cannot be done," they might suggest a safer alternative. The temple will appear even more graceful if we follow the mountain's natural line. A wonderfully diplomatic way of saying, the mountain has already made its decision. Nature always had the final word. Many engineers developed extraordinary memories. Construction could continue for decades. Written records helped, certainly, but countless details lived only inside experienced minds. Which section of the cliff contained hidden fractures? Where had additional support beams been installed 20 years earlier? Which staircase rested above solid bedrock? An engineer might remember thousands of such details. Losing a master engineer through illness or old age represented more than a personal tragedy. It meant losing an entire library. Communication formed another essential part of the job. Instructions needed to be clear. Stonecutters interpreted measurements differently from carpenters. Rope makers worried about loads. Monks focused on sacred spaces. Each group viewed the project through its own experience. The engineer connected them all. He translated ideas into practical work. When disagreements appeared, and they certainly did, the engineer often became the quiet voice, guiding everyone back toward cooperation. Contrary to popular imagination, ancient construction wasn't simply endless physical labor. It involved constant problem solving. Suppose workers discovered, unexpectedly, soft stone halfway through carving a chamber. Do they continue? Reinforce it? Move the room entirely? Every solution affects dozens of future decisions. Engineering resembles an enormous conversation where every answer creates another question. The best masters never stopped asking those questions. Weather demanded flexibility as well. After a harsh winter, new cracks might appear. Heavy rain could alter drainage patterns. A small landslide might block an important supply path. Rather than stubbornly following the original plan, experienced engineers adapted. Rigid plans often failed. Flexible thinking survived. There was also an artistic side to their work. A temple wasn't merely safe, it needed to inspire. Columns should appear balanced. Hallways should feel welcoming. Windows should frame breathtaking views. Visitors climbing exhausting mountain trails deserved more than functional shelter. They deserved beauty. The finest engineers understood that mathematics and art weren't rivals, they were partners. One provided strength, the other provided wonder. Many engineers also possessed surprising humility. Unlike kings, they couldn't command gravity. Unlike priests, they couldn't pray away structural weaknesses. The mountain demanded respect from everyone equally. Experienced builders learned to observe before acting. If the cliff suggested a better solution, they listened. Perhaps that's why so many hanging temples seem to grow naturally from the rock itself. Rather than forcing the mountain into submission, the engineers worked alongside it. It's an approach that feels remarkably modern, or perhaps remarkably timeless. Sometimes visitors today ask whether ancient engineers possessed mysterious lost knowledge, secret techniques, forgotten formulas, hidden technologies beyond our understanding. The evidence suggests something far less mysterious and far more admirable. They observed carefully, measured patiently, learned continuously, corrected mistakes honestly, shared knowledge generously, repeated successful methods, improved unsuccessful ones. In other words, they practiced engineering, not magic, just exceptionally well. Imagine the satisfaction of returning to a completed temple after 40 years of work, walking through quiet halls where rough stone once stood untouched, watching pilgrims light incense beneath roofs you designed decades earlier, listening to the wind pass gently through wooden corridors that existed only inside your imagination when you were young. Few people experience such moments. Even fewer leave behind buildings that survive for centuries. Yet despite all their remarkable achievements, most master engineers faded quietly into history. Their names weathered away, their graves disappeared, their families moved on, the temples remained. Perhaps that's exactly how many of them preferred it. The monument mattered more than the individual. The work mattered more than recognition. The future mattered more than personal fame. It's a refreshingly humble legacy. As darkness settled over the mountain each evening, the master engineer likely reviewed tomorrow's challenges. Another beam to position, another chamber to carve, another difficult decision waiting with the sunrise. The temple was still unfinished. There was always more work ahead, and somewhere higher on the mountain, a group of monks patiently waited for the sanctuary that would eventually become their home. In our next chapter, we'll leave the construction site behind for a while and step into the quiet world of the monks who chose to live among the clouds, where isolation, silence, and breathtaking heights became part of everyday life. Chapter 9. Monks who lived above the clouds. By now, our temple has begun to take shape. The scaffolding is slowly disappearing. The great wooden beams have found their permanent homes. Stone halls echo softly beneath newly finished roofs. The mountain, after decades of patient work, is beginning to resemble the vision the master engineers imagined so many years before. But buildings, no matter how beautiful, exist for a purpose. A temple is not merely a collection of carefully arranged stones. It is meant to be lived in, prayed in, protected, remembered, and for many of these remarkable cliffside sanctuaries, that responsibility belonged to a small community of monks. Imagine waking before dawn every single morning, not to the sound of traffic, not to an alarm clock, not even to the crowing of a village rooster. Instead, you awaken to silence, the kind of silence that only mountains can create. A cool breeze slips gently through wooden windows. Clouds drift lazily beneath your room, rather than above it. Far below, rivers wind through valleys that seem almost too distant to be real. The first rays of sunlight slowly touch the opposite cliffs, painting them with warm shades of gold. For the monks living here, this wasn't an extraordinary vacation. It was Tuesday. Most monasteries followed a carefully structured routine. Long before sunrise, a wooden bell or a simple block of carved timber echoed through the quiet halls. No frantic ringing, no shouting, just a calm reminder that another day had begun. The monks rose quietly from simple sleeping mats. There were no luxurious bedrooms, no grand furniture. Most rooms contained little more than a bedroll, a blanket, a small wooden shelf, and perhaps a few carefully treasured possessions. Life was intentionally uncomplicated. The fewer distractions, the easier it became to focus on spiritual practice. At least, that was the hope. Human beings have always possessed an impressive ability to become distracted. Even on the side of a mountain, morning prayers often began before the sun appeared above the horizon. Dozens of voices softly recited familiar verses. The sound drifted through open corridors and disappeared into the valleys below. Imagine standing on a wooden balcony suspended hundreds of feet above the earth while listening to those gentle chants. The mountains themselves seemed to answer. Every echo returned slightly softened, as though nature had quietly joined the conversation. After prayers came work. Contrary to popular imagination, monks rarely spent entire days sitting perfectly still while contemplating life's deepest mysteries. Someone had to sweep the halls, repair leaking roofs, carry water from mountain springs, prepare meals, care for gardens, copy sacred manuscripts, welcome travelers, maintain wooden walkways constantly exposed to harsh mountain weather. Peaceful living required a surprising amount of maintenance. A monastery functioned much like a small village. Everyone contributed. Some monks specialized in studying sacred texts. Others became skilled herbal healers. A few devoted themselves to preserving ancient manuscripts, carefully copying every character by hand. One misplaced brush stroke might change the meaning of an entire passage. Accuracy demanded remarkable concentration. Fortunately, monks had plenty of opportunities to practice concentration. Many monasteries cultivated small gardens wherever space allowed. Tiny terraces carved into the mountainside supported vegetables, medicinal herbs, and fruit trees. The soil often had to be carried uphill basket by basket. Imagine building a garden by transporting the ground itself. It's gardening on a level few modern homeowners would willingly attempt. Water remained precious. Natural springs supplied many mountain temples, but every drop mattered. Monks developed ingenious systems of bamboo pipes, stone channels, and wooden troughs to guide fresh water throughout the monastery. Nothing was wasted. Rainwater was collected whenever possible. Mountain living encouraged resourcefulness. Food remained wonderfully simple. Rice, vegetables, beans, wild greens gathered from nearby forests. Occasionally, fruit, tea warmed cold mornings and long evenings. Many communities practiced vegetarian diets, although customs varied depending on local traditions and available resources. Nobody expected elaborate feasts. Meals existed to sustain the body, not entertain it. That probably made washing the dishes considerably easier. Silence played an important role in many monasteries. Certain hours of the day were devoted entirely to quiet reflection. Conversation became unnecessary. Workers communicated through gestures. Footsteps echoed gently through stone corridors. Even ordinary tasks acquired a peaceful rhythm. For modern visitors, accustomed to constant noise, the experience can feel almost unfamiliar. Silence isn't empty. It's simply filled with different things. Wind, birdsong, flowing water, your own thoughts. Whether that last one feels relaxing depends entirely on the day you've had. Life above the clouds also demanded resilience. Winter arrived early. Snow sometimes blocked mountain paths for weeks. Strong winds rattled wooden shutters throughout the night. Dense fog occasionally wrapped the monastery so completely that neighboring buildings disappeared from view. There were mornings when stepping outside felt like walking into a sea of white clouds. Beautiful, but not especially useful if you were trying to find someone carrying breakfast. Despite the isolation, monasteries were rarely completely alone. Pilgrims climbed the mountain, seeking blessings, wisdom, or simply a moment of peace. Some arrived after walking for days. Others carried offerings of food, cloth, oil, or incense. A few sought answers to deeply personal questions. The monks welcomed them with quiet hospitality, not extravagant luxury, just kindness, a warm meal, a safe place to rest. Sometimes the greatest gift offered by a mountain monastery wasn't profound wisdom. It was simply a moment of calm in a very complicated world. Travelers often describe these places with genuine awe after exhausting climbs along narrow mountain trails. The sudden appearance of elegant wooden halls clinging to impossible cliffs felt almost dreamlike. Many believed they had entered a place suspended somewhere between earth and heaven. That impression wasn't accidental. The builders had designed it that way. Everything encouraged visitors to slow down, to breathe, to notice. Even the journey became part of the spiritual experience. Living at such heights also reminded the monks of nature's tremendous power. Thunderstorms rolled dramatically through mountain valleys. Lightning illuminated distant peaks. Clouds swallowed entire landscapes within minutes before revealing them once more. Watching the changing weather became almost a daily meditation. Nothing remained permanent. Not the clouds, not the seasons, not even the mountains themselves, slowly shaped by wind and rain over countless centuries. Many monks saw important lessons in that constant change. Perhaps that's one reason these isolated communities endured for so long. They accepted that patience accomplishes what force often cannot. The mountain cannot be hurried, neither can wisdom. Evenings settled gently over the monastery. Oil lamps flickered behind wooden windows. The final prayers echoed softly through quiet halls. Stars appeared in astonishing numbers above the dark mountain peaks. Without the glow of modern cities, the night sky revealed itself in breathtaking detail. Imagine stepping outside before sleep, looking upward, seeing thousands upon thousands of stars stretching across the heavens, while cool mountain air carried the scent of pine forests below. It's little wonder so many monks believed these places brought them closer to something eternal, yet their lives weren't separated entirely from the wider world. News still arrived. Kings changed. Dynasties rose and fell. Wars occasionally swept through distant valleys. Merchants carried stories from bustling cities far below. The monks listened, then returned to their daily routines. Empires might change in a generation. The mountain measured time differently. Today, when visitors carefully climb ancient stairways toward these remarkable temples, it's easy to admire the breathtaking architecture, but perhaps the greatest achievement wasn't the engineering alone. It was creating a place where ordinary people could spend a lifetime surrounded by silence, discipline, and extraordinary beauty. A place where clouds drifted beneath the windows, where sunrise marked the beginning of prayer, where the mountain itself became both teacher and companion. And as these peaceful communities quietly carried on their lives, high above the valleys, remarkable cliffside temples began appearing across different regions of Asia, each shaped by its own culture, beliefs, and landscape. In our next chapter, we'll journey across mountains and centuries to visit some of the most extraordinary hanging temples ever built, discovering how different civilizations transformed towering cliffs into sacred places that continue to inspire travelers even today. Chapter 10: Famous Hanging Temples. Across Asia, as the morning mist slowly drifts away from our quiet mountain monastery, it's time to leave one cliff behind and begin a much longer journey, not through years, but across an entire continent, because the idea of building sacred places high above the earth wasn't limited to one kingdom or one religion. Again and again, across Asia, different civilizations looked toward towering mountains and reached remarkably similar conclusions. If a place felt closer to the heavens, perhaps it was the perfect place to pray. Tonight, we'll visit some of the most extraordinary hanging temples ever created. We'll travel from the dramatic cliffs of northern China to the volcanic mountains of Japan, to the rock-cut sanctuaries of India and beyond. Each temple tells a different story, yet all of them share one remarkable characteristic. Someone looked at an almost impossible cliff and decided to build there anyway. Let's begin in northern China. Imagine standing in a narrow valley where sheer limestone cliffs rise almost straight into the sky. Halfway up one of those towering walls, wooden buildings seem to float in midair. From a distance, they almost appear weightless, as though a strong breeze might carry them gently away. Of course, a closer look quickly reminds you that gravity has been trying exactly that for well over 1,000 years. This is one of history's most astonishing architectural achievements. A temple built directly into a vertical cliff. Visitors often stop speaking the moment they see it, not because anyone asks them to, because the view quietly steals the words away. Wooden corridors cling to the rock. Narrow bridges connect separate halls. Supporting beams disappear deep into the mountain itself. Everything seems impossibly delicate, yet the structure has survived countless winters, powerful storms, earthquakes, and centuries of changing empires. Sometimes, history's quietest buildings prove to be the strongest. According to tradition, the location wasn't chosen simply because it looked dramatic. The cliff offered natural protection from flooding. Strong, overhanging rock shielded the buildings from rain and direct sunlight. Most importantly, the mountain itself became part of the architecture. Rather than fighting nature, the builders cooperated with it, a lesson repeated throughout history. Travel farther south and west into India, and the story changes. Instead of attaching wooden buildings to cliffs, ancient craftsmen began removing the mountain itself. Imagine approaching what appears to be an ordinary rock face, then discovering an entire temple carved inside. Pillars, prayer halls, shrines, columns decorated with astonishing detail. Everything created not by stacking stone blocks, but by patiently removing millions of pounds of solid rock. It's engineering in reverse. Most buildings begin with empty space. These began with solid mountains. Every hammer strike removed something that didn't belong. One careless mistake couldn't simply be repaired by replacing a stone. The mountain offered no second chances. Imagine spending decades carving a ceiling, knowing it had to remain perfectly supported by the stone surrounding it. That required extraordinary confidence and perhaps remarkably steady hands. In Western India, entire cave complexes gradually expanded over centuries. One generation carved a simple meditation chamber. The next added pillars. Another created elaborate sculptures. By the time construction ended, the mountain had quietly transformed into a city of temples, hidden inside living rock. No towering cranes, no roaring machinery, just patience measured across lifetimes. Now our journey carries us toward Japan. Here the mountains possess a different character. Steep forests, towering cedar trees, mist-covered valleys, sacred waterfalls cascading through ancient stone. Many Japanese temples weren't suspended dramatically from sheer cliffs like those in China. Instead, they embraced the mountains themselves. Wooden platforms projected above valleys. Long staircases climbed endlessly upward. Buildings seemed to emerge naturally from forests rather than dominate them. One famous temple overlooks an entire hillside from a vast wooden terrace supported by hundreds of carefully joined timber columns. Stand upon that platforms during autumn, and waves of brilliant red and golden leaves stretch toward the horizon. Visit during spring, and blossoms drift gently through the mountain air. The architecture changes with the seasons. Nature becomes part of the building. Perhaps that was always the intention. In the Himalayan regions, monasteries climbed even higher, sometimes so high that clouds gathered below their windows for weeks at a time. Perched upon rocky outcrops, these communities appeared almost impossible to reach. Narrow mountain paths wound upward through cliffs, where even experienced travelers paused to catch their breath. Supplies often arrived by mule caravans, sometimes by human porters. Every meal required extraordinary effort before it ever reached the kitchen. Yet generation after generation continued living there. Isolation wasn't viewed as hardship alone. It became part of spiritual discipline. Farther south, hidden among the limestone mountains of Southeast Asia, monks discovered caves shaped by water over countless centuries. Rather than constructing entirely new buildings, they transformed natural caverns into peaceful sanctuaries. Small shrines rested beneath towering stalactites. Stone stairways disappeared into darkness before emerging into chambers filled with filtered sunlight. Nature had already completed much of the architecture. Human hands simply finished the conversation. One fascinating pattern appears wherever we travel. Different languages, different religions, different kingdoms, different artistic traditions, yet remarkably similar engineering principles. Respect the mountain, study the rock, work patiently, accept nature's limits, adapt whenever necessary. Whether builders worshipped Buddha, Shiva, local mountain spirits, or other sacred traditions, the mountain remained everyone's greatest teacher. It demanded humility equally from kings and laborers. Many travelers throughout history described these places in almost identical language: peaceful, silent, astonishing, impossible. The word impossible appears surprisingly often, perhaps because that's exactly how these temples continue to feel, even today. Modern visitors arrive carrying cameras instead of walking sticks, comfortable hiking boots instead of woven sandals, water bottles instead of clay jars. Yet after the climb, most reactions remain wonderfully familiar. People stop, look upward, smile quietly, and ask exactly the same question travelers asked hundreds of years ago. How did they build this? It's a question worth asking. But perhaps there's another question equally important. Why did they build this? Not for wealth. Mountain temples rarely generated great fortunes. Not for military advantage. Many possessed little strategic value. Not for comfort. Life on remote cliffs was rarely easy. They built because beauty mattered, because faith mattered, because creating something that inspired future generations seemed worth decades of patient effort. Standing before these remarkable sanctuaries today, it's tempting to imagine that they appeared exactly as we see them now, perfectly preserved, untouched by time. The truth is gentler. Roofs have been repaired, wooden beams replaced, stone steps restored. Caretakers from countless generations quietly protected these places from weather, insects, earthquakes, and simple old age. Preservation became its own form of devotion. The temples survived because people continued caring for them. It's a partnership stretching across centuries. Builders began the story. Caretakers continued it. Visitors now become part of it. As our journey across Asia draws to a close, one thing becomes wonderfully clear. The greatest achievement wasn't constructing a single magnificent temple. It was proving, again and again, across thousands of miles and hundreds of years, that ordinary people armed with simple tools, extraordinary patience, and unwavering determination could transform impossible cliffs into places of lasting peace. And yet, even after these temples stood proudly above the valleys, one final mystery remained. How did ancient craftsmen carve graceful halls, peaceful chambers, and intricate sanctuaries directly into solid mountains without causing the entire cliff to collapse? That remarkable story awaits us in our next chapter, where we'll step inside the living rock itself and discover the patient art of carving rooms from a mountain. Chapter 11: Carving Rooms into Solid Rocks. So far, we've watched ancient builders carry stone up impossible cliffs. We've admired the ropes, the scaffolding, and the master engineers who patiently transformed dangerous mountains into places of worship. But now we arrive at perhaps the most astonishing chapter of all, because sometimes the builders didn't carry stone anywhere. Instead, they removed it. Imagine standing before an enormous cliff. No doors, no windows, no pillars. Nothing but an endless wall of solid rock stretching into the sky. Most people would see a mountain. An ancient master mason saw a temple waiting to be uncovered. It is a remarkable way of thinking. Instead of asking, "What shall we build here?" they asked, "What can we reveal from within?" The difference may sound small. In reality, it changed everything. Building with stone blocks allows mistakes. If one block breaks, another can replace it. If a wall leans slightly, adjustments are possible. Carving directly into a mountain offers no such luxury. Every strike of the hammer permanently changes the cliff. Once a piece of stone disappears, it never returns. Imagine writing an entire book without the ability to erase a single word. That was the level of confidence ancient stone masons needed every single day. Before carving began, the master engineer and the senior masons spent weeks studying the cliff face, sometimes months. They examined every crack, every natural fault, every color change in the rock, every place where water seeped after rain. The mountain quietly revealed its strengths and its weaknesses. Experienced craftsmen learned to recognize them all, not through magic, not through mysterious lost knowledge, simply through decades of careful observation. Many rock-cut temples began at the top rather than the bottom. At first, that sounds completely backward. Surely you begin with the foundation. Normally, yes, but when carving into solid rock, beginning at the top protected completed work below. Loose debris naturally fell downward. Finished ceilings remained untouched. Workers slowly carved deeper, while gravity helped remove broken stone. It was a wonderfully practical solution, and gravity, for once, became an enthusiastic assistant instead of a constant source of anxiety. The first chambers were often surprisingly small. Simple rooms, modest meditation spaces, places where monks could pray quietly, while larger sections remained unfinished. Construction didn't always wait for perfection. Life continued while the mountain slowly changed around it. The tools themselves appear almost humble by modern standards. Iron chisels, wooden mallets, heavy stone hammers, bronze measuring rods, plumb lines, simple levels, no roaring power tools, no diamond-tipped drills, only patient hands repeating the same careful motion thousands upon thousands of times. Tap, 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 hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The mountain gradually surrendered. One fascinating challenge involved ceilings. Normally, builders construct roofs after walls. Rock-cut temples reversed the entire process. The ceiling had to be carved first. Imagine standing beneath several thousand tons of untouched stone while carefully removing just enough material to create a perfectly level roof. Remove too little, the room feels cramped. Remove too much, well, the mountain might express its opinion rather dramatically. Ancient masons developed extraordinary discipline. Every strike mattered. Many craftsmen marked guidelines directly onto the rock using charcoal, red ochre, or scratched lines. These simple markings acted like road maps inside the mountain. Follow the line, check the angle, measure again, then continue carving. Modern architects rely on digital models. Ancient builders trusted careful planning and remarkably steady nerves. Columns presented another fascinating puzzle. Unlike ordinary buildings, where columns are assembled piece by piece, rock-cut columns were never added. They were left behind. Imagine carving an entire room while deliberately refusing to remove certain sections of stone. Those untouched sections eventually became elegant pillars supporting the ceiling above. The column had always existed inside the mountain. The mason simply revealed it. It's almost like sculpture on a gigantic scale. The same principle applied to staircases. Workers didn't build steps. They uncovered them. A solid block of rock gradually transformed into graceful stairs simply by removing everything that wasn't a staircase. Michelangelo would later express a similar idea about sculpture. Ancient temple builders had quietly practiced the concept for centuries. Lighting became one of the greatest challenges. The deeper workers carved, the darker the chambers became. Oil lamps flickered against rough walls,